what makes behavioral intervention for individuals with autism, behavioral education, effective? Part of understanding that is how we view autism. So let's imagine that this line represents normal development. Now, if we were all alive, I would say, who here sees the problem with this line representing normal development? And notice I'm using normal in air quotes. I'm a little uncomfortable with the word normal because what's normal? Right? But normal is ostensibly you and me. Like, we like to think that we're normal. Maybe our spouses disagree. But you're probably yelling at your computer, one line doesn't represent everybody. One line, normal isn't this linear thing. Absolutely, you got it. So what is normal? Normal, so to speak, is a spectrum or a range. So we would all identify that we are somewhere on the normal range, right? Most of the things we do are considered acceptable by society because society determines what that range is. Sometimes we might push the boundaries of those. And normal is a range of excess and deficit. And you can use these words to think about excesses are things that maybe you are good at, right? Maybe you've got really good social skills. That's a behavioral excess. Or it could be something that you do too much of. You eat too many French fries. That's an excess. Or deficit could be something that you don't do enough of, like don't get enough exercise, or an area in which your repertoire is weak. Maybe you're poor at social skills or bad at math or can't play the piano, right? And so normal is the spectrum, and we all exist somewhere on this normal spectrum with our individual strengths and weaknesses and challenges and strengths and stretches, to use the new IEP lingo. So that's normal, whatever normal is, just to kind of beat that horse a little bit more. Sometimes I pretend to be normal, but it gets boring, so I go back to being me. Normal is an illusion. What is normal for the spider is chaos for the fly. And as I said, what is normal is decided by a society that we live in, right? So I don't want people to go, we shouldn't be focusing on normal. I get you, I totally agree with you. Normal is this range. But when we're thinking about normal for our students, normal is the range in which they're most likely to be successful in society, right? And that is just the reality. So we're not trying to force kind of rigid conformity for the sake of conformity. It's really just about enabling maximal access to reinforcers that we all want to enjoy. So if this is normal, right, this is you and me, then this is the autism spectrum. And what you'll notice about the autism spectrum is they're the same behaviors as people in the quote-unquote normal spectrum engage in. They tend to happen to a more extreme degree, right? Either in the excess or the deficit direction. People with autism don't have behaviors that are reserved only for people with autism, right? If you think about one of the stereotypes of a child with autism, hand flapping, well, if you go into any preschool long enough, daycare, you'll see typically developing kids who don't have autism who engage in little bits of stereotypy too, right? A little bit of posturing. It's normal, right? But it happens to a greater extreme, right, with autism, or it doesn't have to. So let me break down some of these categorically for you. Looking at the top in excesses, repetitive behaviors, right? Stereotyped interest and patterns of behavior, often referred to as stimming. All of these things occur in the normal range and can occur outside the normal range. So we all stim if stimming is defined as behaviors you engage in just because it feels good in your nervous system, right? Like if I had hair, I might twirl my hair. Right? If I had a longer mustache, I might play with my mustache. If you tap your fingers, this could be a stim. The issue is, so first of all, except we all stim. Stimming is normal, except when I stim, I can still pay attention to the world around me. I'm still available for learning. I'm still available for social interaction. And the difference is for a person on the autism spectrum, and of course there will be individual differences. I don't want to paint too broad a stroke here. For a lot of people on the autism spectrum, students, when they're engaging in their stereotypy, it is all-consuming, and it is to the exclusion of paying attention to the environment. Remember, learning occurs in the environment, responding to antecedents and consequences. If I'm wrapped up in my own world of stereotypy and it feels good in my nervous system, I'm not paying attention to those things. That will potentially have a cumulatively negative impact on learning. You're less available for learning, right? You're not socially interacting. You're not responding to the natural cues that all of the typically developing peers are in the progress of typical development. So that's a concern. It's a concern if it interferes with broader success. And so in some cases, it can be appropriate to target that to reduce stereotypies or stimming if it's getting in the way of acquiring other things. It's not trying to suppress stimming for the sake of suppressing stimming, right? It's for a functional outcome. And there are ways of doing this where I've had some students who recognized, they'll tell me that they don't want to stim because they know that their peers think that it's odd, and they don't want to be thought of as odd or weird, and they want to stop doing it. They recognize that it's just a habit they're engaging in. They don't need to do it, they just tend to be doing it, and they self-identify that they want to stop doing it. Great. There are other people on the autism spectrum and who are self-advocating who are saying, leave my stims alone. All right. There are some students where the stimming is so significant, or sorry, another way to think about this is, you can't take away stimming, right? We all stim. You can't take it away from me because it feels good in my nervous system. For some kids, we actually teach them where it is okay and not okay to do it. Like if you want to stim at home, we would prefer you don't do it in the living room, but you can go to your bedroom. And you start to introduce kind of these boundaries and this idea of public and private, which is helpful for everybody's development, right? There are certain things you do in private that you don't do in public. And so again, the meaningful outcome has to be individually determined. You can't have a blanket statement that says all stimming is okay or all stimming should be eradicated. It has to be individually determined. Problem behaviors. When you were a child, you had problem behaviors, I had problem behaviors. Some of us still have problem behaviors, but those problem behaviors occur in the quote unquote normal range. Some people with autism have problem behaviors that are certainly outside the normal range, right? They stand out in terms of their intensity and duration and the form that they take, right? We know some of those students. Some schools contact me because they want help addressing those behaviors for some students. It's just a degree, it's a matter of degree or extreme, right? It's not reserved just for people with autism. And the other really important point to make here that applies to all these categories is, just because a person has autism doesn't mean that they're going to engage in problematic levels of stereotypy or stimming. Doesn't mean that they will have problem behavior, right? I know some kids where their parents will say, oh, my child with autism, he's the easy one or she's the easy one. I wish my other kids were as well behaved. I know some teachers who will say, oh, Albert with autism, oh, he's a dream. He's never a problem. Can you come and see these other kids who don't have autism? Right, so just having the label doesn't explain the behavior, right? Insistence on sameness is this idea of rigidity or this rigid insistence on sameness. Things have to stay the same, and if sameness is violated, that causes problem behavior. We call that rigidity, and it can manifest in different ways, like arranging the environment, and then people can't change where little idiosyncratic things are in the environment. A child builds a Lego set, and then nothing in that Lego set can change. That would be an example of insistence on sameness. And again, we all have insistence on sameness, right? You might have a bit of insistence on sameness like me that sometimes pushes the boundary, and your spouse might say you're being a little OCD about that, right? You like things a particular way. If someone came into your home every day and just moved stuff while you were sleeping, right? Now your underwear is in the kitchen and your forks and knives are in the bathroom, that would be very aggravating. So it's normal to want some insistence on sameness. And we all have that to some extreme, but we then also, if we're in the normal range, so to speak, we have the ability to be flexible when we need to be. And that is simply adaptive and good for us, and it's good for our students too, right? So there's some people on the autism spectrum where this is the characteristic that often defines their autism. They're known as, this is the rigid student, where they're very intolerant to change. Or there's some kids on the spectrum who have, this is not an issue at all, right? So just having the label of ASD doesn't guarantee that any of these things are happening. I could go on, but I'll move forward for the sake of time. If you look at the bottom, the areas of so-called deficit, that is the traditional triad of impairment that typically leads to the diagnosis of autism. It was very consistent with the former Diagnostic and Statistical Manual that was used up until recently, before we moved to the 5th edition. If a child presents with impaired communication, they're not socially responsive, or that's impaired, and they are not playing typically, therefore they're much more likely to be filling their time with repetitive behaviors. Those are some of the warning flags that lead to the diagnosis of autism. And for folks who we used to refer to as having Asperger's, although that term has been removed from the DSM, they would have language and communication in the normal range, but still often struggle with social skills and with play and fixed interests and things like that. Right? So this is how we view, as a behavior analyst, this is how I view autism. When I meet a student with autism, I go, okay, you're just a person like me, but you've got certain areas of deficit and we can address those through instruction. And you've got certain areas of excess and we can address those through instruction, because an ABA program for autism is essentially effective teaching. So the goal of behavioral education is to teach to the excesses and deficits. This is the goal of behavioral intervention for autism, or behavioral education for autism, to use effective teaching to achieve the best outcome for the individual so that they have the best quality of life, again, not teaching conformity, to teach skills to bring them towards more into that typical range, because that's the range that society has kind of determined, and in which you can be the most successful and access the most reinforcers and require the least supports. So this is the goal. And in some cases, you actually achieve an objective or goal kind of like this, right? When I described earlier before the break, some of the students I worked with who went on to graduate and go on to university, this is kind of what their profile looks like, but it's certainly not the case for everybody. We simply want individuals to achieve the greatest quality of life possible. So let me, beat that drum one more time. The goal is not to change the person or to fix their autism or to eradicate their autism or that you're unaccepting of their autism. It is not just for the sake of conforming to society because we want you to conform to society. That is not the case. It is to enable the person to achieve their greatest potential, access their desired reinforcers, because really as autonomous adults, we live our lives seeking things that make us happy, accessing reinforcers. We want the same for our students. And have the most dignity and the highest quality of life possible, right? That's what we want for our students, not conformity.